Welcome along to Top Shelf Tech. Today we're going to talk about why security matters in the boardroom, and we have a special guest joining us today. We have Heng Mok, who is the CISO for Zscaler in APJ. Heng, welcome along and thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the show, Jeremy.
Cool. Hey, look, just to start us off, do you mind giving us a little bit of on your background and what you've done in your various security roles?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess if I think about my sort of career, I've done a variety of roles in the cyber world. I started off as a application developer in the late 90s and sort of moved on into consulting after that in the early 2000s. So I did a lot of things like system integration with identity systems. Did a lot of pen testing back in those days, and then spent, I guess, the majority of my career after that as in the security architecture function and managing security teams. So, building out cyber strategy, working out roadmaps, working on large transformation projects across Australia, and everything from banking all the way through to energy, which sort of then led me into, I guess, managing different cyber functions. So starting off with security architecture and then moving into, forensics and data protection teams, and then finally sort of special projects, and then into the role of a CISO in industry in the critical infrastructure space in Australia. And, I thought, well, I've never done a vendor gig, and, the latest sort of foray is into the vendor side and being, I guess, a CISO in this particular part of the world and the region.
And how have you found that vendor side of things in terms of, I guess, just the different exposure that you might get globally?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's been pretty interesting. Like, I guess, historically being insulated with the Australian market and New Zealand market to a large extent of my career, and then, sort of shifting to this particular region, it's been really interesting just to see, I guess, the various maturity levels of the different countries, the different cultural differences as well, and the different approaches to cybersecurity as well. You find that in this particular region, especially, every country sort of, operates fairly differently. They've got different regulatory mandates and, different approaches to the way that they deal with the cyber problem. So, that part and that exposure has been quite interesting for me. The psychology side of having to do different talk tracks to various countries and various leaders, and, understanding that cultural context and trying to tailor the message has been pretty interesting.
So we're talking about why security matters in the boardroom, and you kind of just touched on a point around different regulatory environments and different audiences. At a board level, do you find that there is a lot of variance in the type of companies and boards and approaches to security, or is the environment homogenizing a little bit where there is a well understood risk and sort of management frameworks for cybersecurity at that level?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what we're starting to see is that, from a visibility perspective, every board is now interested in cybersecurity. I go back sort of 10 years ago and, it was fairly varied, right? It would depend on the industry. So the more regulated industries such as, financial services that have always had, control frameworks, that have had risk frameworks, 3 lines of defense, have been more mature. And what you're starting to see now is with, I guess, the regulatory frameworks coming into play around critical infrastructure, you're seeing more of, I guess, that mandate and that visibility at the board level. But then I guess you've also got, family-run boards as well in some of the smaller organizations and private companies, which are still trying to get up to speed. So, I'd say that it's fairly varied. But in terms of the approach, we're starting to see some homogenization in the approach. So, the adoption of cybersecurity frameworks such as, the NIST CSF as a broader mechanism to sort of look at, posture and where security is at, and the ability to compare that with other industries is sort of there. But then you're also seeing, I guess, from a risk perspective, various levels where you've still got, some of the quantitative pieces starting to come in now with like fair modeling and scenario-based annualized loss expectancy metrics. but you're also seeing, I guess, the standard sort of 5x5 subjective, risk tier 1 operational risk metrics come into play. So, it is fairly varied, but I think that, over time, what you are going to see is that, some sort of standardization in this space. Then, if you understand the risk profile of an organization, it's going to be different depending on, how digitally connected it is, the type of information it handles, as well as, I guess, the issues around reputation and trust.
Yeah, and one of the things that that we'd probably observe is you do have that broad spread. And you mentioned sort of family-owned boards right up to very experienced corporate boards, and a little bit regardless of them of I guess how good they are at other elements of their role. One of the things that we would probably find a little bit in the interactions is this can be quite a foreign concept with very different language to it, and sort of talking about things that are kind of sound like spy games, with espionage and state actors, and all these these kind of risks to actually frame them and understand them. You've probably got as good a chance as discussing, Darth Vader's going to come down with the Death Star. It's just very different concepts. How do you find educating boards to get to that level of understanding that it's not this kind of sort of hard to understand way out there thing, but very real risk, very tangible risk with that kind of whole background?
Yeah, so I mean, in a sort of previous life, the way that I sort of, broke up my sort of role with the board was really around, two areas. One was around education, and one was around, I guess, governance and the operational metrics and managing the risk. So on the education side, we would do things like, threat papers that would go up whenever we saw something which was either industry related or within the context of the organization. And, that could be reactive to a media incident, to a threat intelligence piece that we saw within our organization. It could have been a security incident or a case that we managed, right, which was relevant. And the ongoing education of those, I guess, threat papers or position papers to the board, gave them a good view of, I guess, the continual pieces that we were trying to manage operationally from a cyber perspective. And it sort of reinforced, I guess, where we were investing, right? So when you think about that journey of, I guess, having to continually invest and sustain controls, it gave them a good view of the types of threats that were specific to our organization, our industry, broadly to this region as well. And, that sort of helped them understand. So when we came to sort of position, I guess, every quarter, with our formal board papers, they already had a whole lot of context of what had led up to that particular point in time. So the continuous education piece was sort of really important to bring them up to speed. And then I guess the way that we were managing the risk with initiatives, with controls, with the way that we were looking at things holistically across our service chain and the servicing of controls across that particular value chain was really important. So being able to bring that business context, but also provide them with a continual view of what was actually happening, sort of helped us, come to that position of continuous education. And I think that, boards need that, right? They need that continual context, and they need that continual view of what is relevant to your organization, because every cyber team operationally is dealing with incursions and incidents every single day. It's the materiality of those particular pieces, and the controls that you've got, and where you need to fine tune some of those continuous gaps.
And today we're talking about why security matters in the boardroom, and I think to even understand why, you've got to understand the what first, a little bit of what you talked about, and what's happening, what the actual threats are out there. And I guess just probably putting a slightly different angle on that, what would the fun when you're observing companies that have very good board governance around security versus companies that don't, what are those fundamental impacts that you see for the organizations that don't? The operational impacts, the impacts around maybe culture in an organization. How does that impact the day-to-day running of a business when they do not have that right at a board level?
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting question. I think that it comes down to things like funding, right? When a cyber team is not, I guess, or the board doesn't understand, I guess, the the view of where the organization is at, its risk profile, generally you find that, funding becomes an issue for cyber teams, right? The ability to sustain some of those controls. You see, I guess, a broad uplift, and then after the uplift, there isn't the sustaining piece. So being able to, I guess, continually position becomes really important for CISOs and the cyber team to demonstrate that it's not just a once-off investment, it's a continual investment. The second part is that, access to the board and access to senior management. The more sort of access the CISO has to the board directly as well to management, you find that, then that becomes quite a good way to, get on the same page and ensure that both the business objectives as well as the risk profile and risk appetite is being managed within that tolerance level. The other aspect that you do see is that, where organizations culturally have scaled and cyber teams have been able to scale and bring that sort of security and safety into the DNA of an organization, then every conversation becomes much easier because everyone is seeing cybersecurity like it is part of the job. So being able for cyber teams that have scaled extremely well, that have brought that culture of security into everyday work and everyday life, and have contextualized it into what the business understands, you find then that there is a greater appreciation of the function. There's greater appreciation of investing in that, and seeing it as like a competitive advantage, right? So that's where we sort of see where, I guess, boards that understand top down, you've got the whole organization heading in the same way. You do find that, from an effectiveness perspective, that cyber teams are able to operate, a lot more freely, as well as in that same sort of way, without having to justify everything all the time.
Now, you started off there by talking about funding, and funding is a funny thing in this industry, right? Like, there's always room to improve. There's always probably more that you're looking for each year. And you also mentioned competitive advantage. So you're asking for money. You've got risk that can actually be quite hard to quantify in terms of, and it's risk. Do I have insurance on my car? Do I not have insurance on my car? What's if I crash it? What's and you can do these calculations, and they're all highly theoretical. What have you found is the best way to frame up funding conversations in terms of how you demonstrate a risk, whether that's quantifiable or sort of based upon a number of variables, and including stuff like competitive advantage? How is that showing up security, being a competitive advantage?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that what we're starting to see now is more of an actual based approach to risk, and this is, I guess, consistent with how other types of risk has been managed, right? If you look at how the actuaries go and do and price up insurance in the general insurance space based on weather events, based on data, and then come up with a mechanism to cover that particular loss. I think that cybersecurity is also starting to head in that way, where it's becoming much more data driven and aligned based on the controls that you have within your organization, based on the effectiveness of those types of controls, and then using that to feed into, I guess, a much more dollar figure amount on how much you actually need to invest.
Is that modeling each organization would then have to do themselves to understand that? Or is that kind of, you think, an area that you'll get to having general guidance for an industry to say, look, you're in utilities, these are the kind of risks you might face, this is maybe a percentage of revenue or something that you need to think about reinvesting in security?
Exactly. It's almost like a capital allocation, right? So I think that, if you think about how credit risk and some of those other business risks are managed, it's essentially by allocation of capital or allocation of an amount. And I think that, that generally is now becoming more mature organizations are actually starting to look at that for their own individual organization. And you're starting to see some capabilities in the industry come out around that sort of stuff, to do that sort of data analytics piece, to be able to feed in a much more sort of rigorous, picture around that. And then that can be used to drive things like investment, or where is the right investment to take down some of that risk. So I think that, you're going to see a lot more of that. And, that to a large extent is almost like a, business value type conversation that you're having, and that the CISO is having around, where to invest the controls to minimize the risk, to ensure that, we can enable these particular, digital functions, which, the business is trying to achieve. So I think that you are seeing that. The other aspects are that there are certain types of security controls that you do implement, which will have a direct, user experience, customer experience impact. And I think that, the more that you sort of, frame the business case around some of that business transformation, again, you're demonstrating that, cyber is a value piece around that, where you can achieve both, I guess, a great experience, but at the same time, you can have the right controls in place to ensure that you're managing that risk for the organization.
So just maybe one topic to leave us on. If you're thinking about how you frame up a conversation with the board in terms of you're talking about an initiative, or about some risk reduction, and this could be you could be a salesperson listening, you could be an executive within a business, but you're trying to frame a problem to the board. The board's got lots of noise, and there's certainly a lot going on from an economic perspective right now that businesses are managing. What would be your number one tip for how you get cut through, how you get a clear message to say, hey, this thing's really important, get through the noise, this is why we need to do it?
Yeah, to tell the truth, I think that the pre-work before getting to board is probably the most important part of that. Influencing your business leaders, influencing your executive management, so that when it comes to the board, it essentially becomes a question of, you've got support from the entire business. It's not just a technology or a cybersecurity initiative. It's actually linked to business strategy. The cyber strategies is sort of, underpinning a large part of where the business wants to drive. And, all that sort of pre-work, prior to the boardroom becomes really important. And that's where, the CISO soft skills around, stakeholder management, around the commercial side of, giving and taking in terms of, where's the best place to invest at that point in time, becomes really important. And then, aligning, I guess, all of that back to a business outcome that will drive value will mean that, essentially you will be successful, right? It's about, when you've got a million different initiatives, it's about, I guess, ensuring that you're going to the business, that you are, that you are presenting that in the right form, and that you are, continually ensuring that you've got everyone trying to, I guess, battle on behalf of the cybersecurity team. It's not just a single lone voice on the side within technology. It's actually the whole business seeing the value and actually then supporting the mechanism there. And I think that part of it is probably the most important part prior to getting to board.
Yeah, and look, that's a great answer. And I think probably I'd say from my experience, that rings very true when I've written papers, sometimes years in advance, talking about this is what we see coming, this is what we need to be thinking about, and these changes will take some time. They're the ones that maybe, the board starts saying, oh, and we remember you wrote this paper, and we remember this, and, sort of linking it back themselves to, those kind of conversations that have been had for a period of time. Look, just I guess in terms of closing out today, firstly, thanks a lot for joining us. Before we went, are there any other thoughts that you wanted to leave the audience with?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the really important part is that, with Cyber Uplift, the positioning really needs to go from, transformation to maturing to sustaining. And, sometimes we get caught up in the transformation side, but the actual sustaining part becomes really important, because when we think about the threat environment, when we think about, I guess, all the things that come up on an ongoing basis, or the fact that the business then pivots and changes its strategy, you need to have that sustaining piece in order for, I guess, the cyber team to support the business in those particular changes. And I think that, getting to that level of discussion with the board around, sustaining and continual investment, becomes a really important pillar for every cyber team to be successful in their role.
Awesome. Look, thanks again for joining us today, Heng. That's been really insightful and really quite interesting, I guess, just looking at that board perspective. So thank you very much for your time, and really appreciate you dropping by.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me on the show, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.